and again, an overall context of how this basin and other basins would deal with scarcity when those times come, and also abundance, because as we know in this valley and throughout the state, we've sort of had in the last 3 years sort of climatological whiplash, right? We've gone from drought to the very next year an extraordinary water year, and then this year was sort of in between, but it came later a lot of times. So we had, we have these sort of seasonal changes. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Abby, and she's going to walk through a very, very interesting presentation on what can be done.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, so many actions are part of our portfolio. By our portfolio, we're talking about what can we do? What can we do as a community? I talked about a little bit earlier about, yes, there are things for seawater intrusion. Yes, there are recharge projects. Here, we're talking about more of what can we do to use less water, conserve more, be more efficient, and on the groundwater side, ultimately take less out of the ground, right? To hit some of those things we talked about earlier. So to get those groundwater savings, there are existing actions. So I talked about some of the Water Resource Agency projects, the Castroville Seawater Intrusion Project. You just heard about what the agricultural industry is doing, what's happening on the urban water side. There's a lot that's already existing. And then we move forward, and what sorts of things can we do? What sorts of projects or management actions can we do? And what are those actions we can do in the future that we might not even be contemplating now, right? Now here we're really focusing on uncertainty and scarcity, thinking forward. As we go forward, we know we have these ups and downs in precipitation. We have floods and droughts. How can we better plan for a resilient future, resilient, sustainable water supplies? Now we have our existing system. We have this uncertainty and some unavoidable challenges. We've talked about drought. There's also growth. There's needs both on the economic side, changes in demand patterns. There's also housing needs and urban needs as well, drinking water needs. There's also the potential for infrastructure failures. Not one we ever want to necessarily have to plan for, but things can happen, and we need to plan for some of those uncertainties. And then, as came up earlier, regulatory changes, right? We know some things that are upcoming, but there may be other regulatory uncertainties, so different laws and different actions of the government that we'll need to put in place locally. So there's a number of different types of uncertainties and unavoidable challenges. So here we're focusing on what can we do as a community? What are those actions? We know bringing up demand management, we know talking about water use can be a scary place. It's a place that a lot of people don't want to talk about. Here we're trying to open the breadth and not start from a narrow silo, but really give you a wider view of what can really fall into that bucket, right? And from there, even if some of them aren't necessarily wanted, if they are scary, we can start talking about what's appropriate, what would work here, how you can, where are there leverage points where there can be greater efficiencies and not necessarily have negative effects? Where can we find those sweet spots? So now bear with me, I'm going to try to back up, put things in a little bit higher of a light. You've heard some concrete examples of what's been done, and you'll hear what can be done. And everything that I'm going to talk about, understand that there are lots of details. There's lots to figure out about specifically how they are put in place, where they are put in place, by who are they put in place by. There's a lot of details behind all of them. And part of this is giving you that framework so that we can think about what is appropriate, what would actually create other benefits, not just to the groundwater system, but to our lives, to our resilience as a community. Okay, so as a starting point, not all actions are created equal. To give you a little bit of a framework for how to think about these, here are a couple different ways you can slice or dice different actions, right? You can think about them about whether they are temporary or permanent. So temporary ones address short-term needs. So droughts, for example. In a drought, you might not need an action that you will need forever, but when you're in that drought, what can you do during that period of time, right? And temporary meaning that you can walk them back too. You can put them in place, but they don't necessarily have to be in place forever, year after year. Permanent actions being supporting projects in the long term, something you put in place and it is there in the future, right? You invest in it, it's there, you accrue benefits down the road. Reliance of benefits. So this is a big question of, okay, we put money into something, we're gonna do something. How do I know we're gonna see those benefits? Will we see them every year? How variable or how risky are those benefits? How much can you bank on them, right? And that's important to put into place, right? If you invest in something and you're assured to have those benefits, that's different than, well, you might have those benefits one year, but they might be less another year. That goes into your cost benefit calculations, right? And then some actions have, as far as that, have variable benefits based on other factors, such as rainfall, right? If you think about being surface water dependent or something depending on surface water or precipitation, that varies depending on if you have a wet year or if you have a dry year. We can think about things being voluntary or obligatory. So it came up earlier, compliance rates, right? If you want to incentivize conservation, one way to go about it are voluntary actions where you say, hey, these are good things to do. And we're going to talk about a few other things you can do even in the voluntary bucket. But the compliance rates you get with voluntary actions is typically different than when you have obligatory or required actions, especially if there's enforcement. So we're thinking of, okay, how many people or how many firms are adopting something to make the calculation of what is the benefit going to be, whether it's voluntary or obligatory factors into that equation. It's one of the key factors. And also I should note, some things don't work very well unless they are obligatory. Right? We'll get to some of those. The cost. So there are variable costs for all actions. And we're not going to dig too deep down in this because it depends on the design of a particular action and who implements and many, many factors. But there are different costs to implement and there are different costs to maintain. So think as far as setting something up, that kind of upfront cost versus over time, year to year, what it takes to continue a program or an action. And then the cost to the local economy versus cost to individuals. I'll also throw in there the cost to the agency who's undertaking the action as well, right? Cost can be viewed in different ways. Ultimately, when we're acting as a community, we want to minimize the costs, but we do realize that the cost is borne on different actors, right? Sometimes something can be very costly for the agency, whoever does it, to put it in place, but the cost is not very high on individuals, unless they are paying for that agency and have to contribute to the ultimate cost of it, versus other times it's pretty cheap to put in place, but it has an impact on others who are essentially bearing that cost, right? So cost comes into play in a couple different ways. Okay, I'm going to go through about a dozen different types of actions. These are one way to organize them. You can organize them in your brain however you want to, but it's just to get you to wrap your head around what can fall into this portfolio. And this also, mind you, is going to be a preface for the exercise we're going to do later, so don't fall asleep because we'll be asking you about these. So, not surprisingly, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just certain ones and certain categories of actions. Generally, they're ranked from low cost to high cost, but as I mentioned, that the costs really vary on how they're put in place, and so it's a really broad brush view just to help you organize these in your mind. And then they can be implemented together or separately. So you can do one, you can do multiple. There are times when they might end up overlapping, and that will ultimately be part of the design phase of actions. And then some are variations on others, so you will see some overlap in there. Okay, urban conservation. You've already heard a good bit about this, so I don't think I need to say a whole lot, but you can get water savings from individuals investing in new practices and new technologies, right? This can be anything from low-flow shower heads to some of the turf replacements and urban gardens that we just heard about. These are typically permanent, so you put on a new shower head. Rarely do you change your shower head the year after, right? You invest in that shower head, you have it, and you have a more efficient shower head for years to come, so you've got more of an upfront cost. These are typically done by municipalities, water companies. They're often voluntary, right? It's pretty hard to go out and say, everybody must put on that shower head and go check every single household to make sure they're there and they're there every year and they haven't switched them back. So these are typically voluntary, often fairly low cost to agencies or companies to put in place. But the benefits are recurring. So you invest in them up front, you accrue benefits over time, and as a program might go on, they might get new people to implement these actions, new individuals every year. Decentralized residential water capture. So by decentralized, we mean you don't just have one recycled water plant or one big project, but you have many individuals who are implementing some sort of action. So these water savings come from individuals, typically from storing rainwater, that precipitation coming down, for non-potable use. So this is where we get into the rain barrels that we were talking about earlier. So can you capture that rainwater, which we can do in California, and use it later? And by using it later, then that means you're able to do the same things without pumping groundwater or your normal supplies of water, right? So you're reducing your normal usage because this lets you save some of that rainwater for later. These are typically permanent. Once you've got a rain barrel installed, you've got it to use. Typically voluntary, fairly low cost, although, as mentioned earlier, the cost benefit for rain barrels varies a bit. I used to live in DC, had a rain barrel, it would fill up, I'd use it, it basically watered my whole garden. Here, we have a rainy season and a dry season, so we tend to get most of the rain during one part of the year, and then we don't have a lot for months. So that means you need a big enough rain barrel to really last you a longer time. It's not refilling every month or so, right? And I know folks who live by rivers and they have these big cisterns, right, which can last them through the dry season, but it's different when you get most of your rain concentrated within a couple months, and when you also usually don't want to irrigate a lot within those couple months. But the benefit for this is usually reoccurring. So you implement it, and then you've got it for years to come. So similarly structured as urban conservation. On the agricultural side, we have promote best management practices. Norm gave us a deep dive into what has been done in the Valley and what is being done by the agricultural sector. There are a number of low-cost actions. Mind you, there are many that are not low-cost as well, but this is on that end of the spectrum. And these water savings come from individuals, and by individuals, in this case, individual farms or growers, right? Investing in these new practices or technologies. So typically these are permanent. You put these in place, and then you have the benefits year to year. They're typically voluntary. It's really hard to say you must put in place this practice because every farm is different, every crop is different, right? Some things are appropriate for one and not another. There's different preferences. But typically you put them in place and then you have those benefits year to year. So as Norm was talking about, what we've done so far in this valley, and not me personally, but all the growers in the valley have done, is a lot, right? They've put in place more efficient irrigation systems, right? They've put in place these practices and we're building from there. We're getting those benefits year after year after year. Limit place of use. This is a little harder to wrap our heads around, but it is something that is out there, not used here, but thought it was worth mentioning. So these water savings come from limiting the place of use. So if you are able to take water and move it elsewhere, that gives more flexibility on where you can use water and the amount of water ultimately that can be used. When the place of use is restricted, that ultimately limits the amount of water that can be used. So it is one way to reduce water use. It can be temporary or permanent. It is usually obligatory, something like an ordinance or a law that says you can't move it to this place or move it beyond this distance or something like that. Low to medium cost, but you get those benefits year after year. So this is a little trickier, site-specific, but is a tool in the toolbox. Moving up to our kind of medium cost actions, this part of this is prefacing you for the exercise, is to provide water use data. So water savings come from individuals assessing their individual water use and increasing efficiency. So this can be everything from evapotranspiration data, that satellite data that looks at the crop evapotranspiration, to some of what Norm was talking about as far as precision irrigation, right? So how do we harness the tools that we have, the various sensors, computing technologies, ET data, to better understand how and when we use water and when water is wasted or when we can be more efficient, right? So it helps us figure out how to be smart water users. And typically, I think we were talking about this on the agricultural side, but that applies to urban areas as well and to urban households. If any of you get an energy bill, and if you're in a system that your energy company spits out, well, here's exactly how much you've used when, and we think it's on appliances like refrigerators versus things you turn on and off, it can help you identify, oh, I can be more efficient by switching to a more efficient refrigerator, or oops, on the water side, I have a leak somewhere, I've got to fix that leak, right? And so it helps us understand where water is being used and where we can be more efficient and help with that behavioral change and sometimes more efficient practices too. Tends to be permanent once you've got a system in place, and especially for the agricultural sector, there are things you can do on a parcel by parcel basis. There are also broader scale programs that can be put in place to help accrue these benefits on a larger scale, not just one grower at a time. It does, for those larger systems, it is some upfront cost, right? You've got to get the systems in place, figure out how to get that data, what the data means, the right sensors. So it tends to be permanent. It is usually voluntary. Medium cost to implement to maintain. Important point, so when we're talking about upfront costs versus over time, we're going to simplify it for the exercise, but some things are more upfront, and then it's just a little bit to maintain it. This tends to have some cost to maintain over time as well. And then you typically do see benefits year after year. While you might increase efficiency more on the front end as you're figuring out where you have leaks or where you can be more efficient, typically we do see benefits over time. Fallowing options. I know, not a word many people like to hear, but we're opening to what all the options are. So for those of you not familiar with fallowing, broadly, it is when agricultural land is idled. So most agricultural land that we're talking about in this valley is irrigated, so we pump water to irrigate the crops. If you don't have a crop that needs irrigation, if you idle that land, then you don't have that water use, essentially, right? But there are many different ways you can do it. In some ways, that might provide more flexibility than others. Mind you, it's not as easy as just leave the land over there. You still need to manage land, right? There may need to be some water used to maintain some sort of cover crop or to somehow manage that land. We don't want another dust bowl. There's a lot of things that can go wrong if you just leave it, right? So there does need to be some management, and it does need to be a purposeful act to fallow and think about how it fits in the overall system. And then let's go into a couple of those options. So one option would be to delay crop replacement. So in areas like the Salinas Valley, where we have multiple crops throughout the year, you can reduce the number of crops you have throughout the year or when it's replaced. This is somewhat of a partial fallowing option where you're not saying no crops here ever, but delaying the start of growing crops. If it is appropriate for those specific crops, certainly every crop has its own specific needs, and that includes the timing throughout the year as well. So these water savings accrue from occasionally fallowing the fields before the crops are replaced. Can be temporary or permanent. Typically, it's voluntary. Now we'll talk about in a moment how that might be able to be incentivized. But the cost generally is low to the public, and by that, I mean the agency or whoever is putting this action in place, but the cost is borne by the growers, right? If you are not growing as many crops, therefore you're not having the same economic revenue. Variable and low and likely low, by that we mean the benefits, I believe. You do accrue benefits year to year. It's not as drastic as fallowing year-round, so the benefit wouldn't be as much as fallowing year-round, but it can accrue some water savings. Another way to think about this is rotational fallowing. If you have a couple different fields, have one that is fallowed while you're growing on the other ones, and then you rotate that. Regrow on that first one, fallow another field, and then rotate that over time. And there are also different strategies to do this where you might be trying to really rejuvenate the soil as well in the meantime, have cover crops that put nitrogen back into the soil. So the water savings come from resting fields on a rotating basis. It tends to be permanent. It doesn't have to be permanent. It is something that can be done and then not done the next year. Typically low cost to the public. Similar to the last one, a program isn't that hard to put in place as far as the cost to an agency, but the cost is borne by the grower when you're looking at the overall cost equation. And then you do have recurring benefits every year if you're utilizing it every year. It is something that can be walked back though, so you could go have rotational fallowing and then in the future not have rotational fallowing. And finally, fallow bank. This is one way to share the economic burden of fallowing. So rather than have individual growers who volunteer to fallow or do rotational fallowing or have anything imposed, if there's an overall need in an area to reduce water consumption, all growers could contribute financially to a fallow bank, and then that would be doled out to those growers who actually do fallow the land. So it's a burden sharing type of mechanism to help incentivize or put in place some fallowing where you're shifting that burden from the grower who's doing it to all growers who are participating in the program. So can be temporary or permanent, but you want to align it such that when people are paying, you're accruing those benefits. Voluntary fallowing, so it can be designed in different ways. Typically it's done where those who are doing the fallowing are volunteering for that. It's not being imposed on them. Medium cost to the public and growers. This is again trying to think about how the cost should be borne and who they should be borne by, right? To equibrelate that a little bit. And then variable benefit year to year. Okay, repurposing and retirement of agricultural land. This is not just the retirees in the photo, we're talking about land here. The kind of extreme end of fallowing is taking land fully out of production for now, forever in the future, so it is permanent, and taking that land, either retiring it and having agreement, or repurposing it. And there's a whole multi-benefit land repurposing program underway in the Valley. Are there ways where, if we want to overall reduce water consumption, can we use land, either just take it out of production, or can we use it for some other beneficial use, be that recreational, environmental uses, in areas that naturally flood? Can we restore those areas or those wetlands, stream restoration, or a combination of those, right? So are there other beneficial uses of that land that still ultimately reduces the overall water use because you're not having irrigated crops on there as well? Permanent, typically voluntary, so it requires purchasing or having some sort of easement on that land, so you need that landowner to want to enter into this agreement and do this. Typically you need to buy the land, right, or there's some financial cost, which tends to be fairly high, so we bumped it up into the high cost category. But you get the benefits in the future, so every year you are not having that same water usage on that parcel. Tiered extraction fees. I know I'm getting into the more uncomfortable area, but as I said, I'm laying out the options. So as we know from the energy industry or urban water uses, I do not know if Cal Water has a tiered system, but we will find that out. They do? It does, yes. Thank you for the answer. Okay, confirmed. That's good. I wasn't sure about that question coming to me. So the idea for this is that everybody should have some water use. What we want to do is encourage efficient use and not wasting water. So the first, however it's set up, the first amount of water, say up to 10 acre feet, totally depends if you're ag or urban or how it's done, you pay X amount per acre foot, so much for a quantity of water. If you use more than that, when you go beyond those 10 acre feet, you pay a higher amount per acre foot. And then if you get bumped to that next tier up, if you look at the little schematic there, the more water you use, the more it's going to cost. It's also somewhat akin to taxes, right? You get bumped into higher tax brackets, you're going to pay a larger percentage to your taxes. Might be a sore spot, I know taxes were just due, but it's a way to try to encourage, maybe not on the tax front, but on the water front, try to encourage greater efficiency, right? Permanent or temporary, it's pretty difficult to do in a temporary way, at least in a year-to-year way, but it is something that you could put in place for a couple of years and then not forever in the future, or you could change how much is paid for each of those tiers, right? That once you set up a structure, you can alter aspects like that. It is obligatory. It doesn't work if your neighbor says, no, I don't want to be in tier 4. I'm not going to pay that. I'm just going to stick here in tier 1. Doesn't work that way. Everybody has to do it. It is a system that you set up as a whole. High cost for managing the program. And it does take some ongoing management, especially given the way our financial laws work as far as really setting this up well, and whether it's a little bit complicated to set up. Maybe I'll just leave it there. It needs to be thoughtfully done, the equity involved in it, the fairness as far as who pays how much, what those levels are, and for how much water and what areas. You have to be really thoughtful about how it's set up from the get-go, and often it needs to be adjusted over time as well. But that's all part of, all of these have all those details behind them as well. So none of these are necessarily simple. And they do have recurring and potentially high benefit, right? When people are incentivized by money to use less water, that often helps significantly, right? And then finally, the end of the spectrum, the last one, compulsory rationing, which is probably the scariest thing to everybody. It is done, especially on the urban side, right? We've heard about these state mandates and what's come down. Basically, the water savings come from enforcing strict limits on water use. That can be overall. It can be, for example, no watering lawns. I'm sure somebody's heard that in the past couple of years, right? You can use water, but not for outdoor irrigation. We need to reduce. So it can be set up in different ways, but it is compulsory. So it is obligatory. Once it's set in place, it must be followed. It can be permanent or temporary. So often on the urban side, this is done just during drought periods, right? When we're in that crunch. Okay, you're not gonna have a pretty lawn this year, but we do wanna make sure that we have enough water for health and safety needs, right? Pretty high cost for managing the program, particularly if there's enforcement of that, right? If you really wanna track it down, that takes money to enforce things like this. But you do get the benefit whenever it is in place. Okay, so that's a world of about 12 actions, simplified as how it was working in my brain right now. You can organize them in your own brains and start sorting through what may make sense, may not make sense, may make sense in this corner of the world or in this way, but not another way. And a lot of that can happen later out of this room. For the purposes of the rest of today, we're gonna do an exercise, and we're gonna simplify this so that we can get done in this period of time. And the ways we're going to simplify it are two main ways. We're going to have a bunch of actions. There's going to be a cost and a benefit for each. And we're going to organize them into three main categories here. So the first category is you pay once, it's a fairly small cost, and you get the benefits year after year, such as urban conservation. You implement that low flush toilet, that more efficient toilet. Well, the whole time you have that toilet, you're going to be using less water than you would have with your less efficient toilet, right? Now, granted, with a lot of the programs, there's some cost to maintain the program over time. We're simplifying it, one cost up front, and then you get the same benefit every year afterwards. We're also simplifying out exactly what percentage, if it's voluntary or obligatory, and what percentage of people are doing it. That's a fact for later. But for the exercise, pay once, small cost, you accrue the benefits every year. The second category, which is somewhere in the middle as far as cost, is that you receive the benefits in the year that it is paid for. So you can use it 1 year, you pay for it, you get the benefit. The next year, you can decide not to use it, not pay for it, and not get the benefits. You use it again, you have to pay again. So you have to pay each year that it's used. For example, some of the fallowing options, right? When it's used, you want to be paying those growers for fallowing. And then the last one, which is somewhat structurally similar to the first one, but higher in cost, is that you pay once and you accrue the benefits year after year. So they both are pay once, use year after year, but there are some that are much higher ticket items. So we bumped them down to a different category, like those tiered extraction fees. Okay, I think there will be more on the exercise. questions on
A little bit more
this?
on the exercise again, incentivizing. Stick around for the exercise. It's really fun. It's a fun exercise. So questions. We'll go ahead and do what we've been doing. Go ahead and raise your hand, speak really loudly, and then we'll go to this gentleman here, and then this one here. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a few questions on some of the slides. Number 12, you have limited place, which I think may be directed at other places, but it could be applied here, I guess. How flexible is this? And I know there's one project in the 18400 being looked at to pump water near Chular and pump it north towards the coast. So is that, how difficult is it within a subbasin to expand the place of where you extract the water and where you use it versus going across subbasins?
Good question. Right now, and Perette's going to tell me when I'm wrong, the subbasin lines don't matter as far as where water is used. In here in Salinas Valley, we will need to adhere with water rights. So there are a series of things regarding where you use water that relate to water rights. So subbasin lines don't necessarily matter for that per se, right?
So where this comes from a bit is that I'm sure several of you know that there are places in the state where water's been moved out of the basin and into another basin. And from a SGMA perspective, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, as you know, you're defined by sustainability within your groundwater basin. So it draws into question, and that's part of what this is, which is if people were commoditizing water, which is, I'm not passing good or bad on that, they're extracting and moving it out. On the one hand, they're treating that as a commodity, but it has a net effect on sustainability within that basin because of just literally the volume in that basin. Is that a reasonable way to put it, Brett?
Yeah, I think import-export is kind of another way of categorizing this bucket of tools that the agency could limit. Don't know if that makes sense here, but it is a tool in the toolbox.
And then on number 17, the fallow bank, is that funded by participants in the program that want to be part of that fallow bank? Is it confined to the subbasin, and does it require a Prop 218?
It is not in place yet, so it is yet to be defined. And I don't think Prop 218 is the only way to go about it, is my understanding, but we would also need legal advice on that. Yeah, and it could be those putting in for it. It could be, I think, potentially a fee charged more broadly on a larger group that then it goes towards fallowing.
Related to this slide right here, on extraction, on well extraction, as it's been relayed earlier and today, the Montgomery County Water Resources Agency keeps track of what the growers turn into them as far as water pumping reports and how much they extracted each year at a 98% success rate. And if I could ask anybody from the Water Resources Agency, perhaps is this, because what I thought I heard today, this is not an obligatory program, it's voluntary. Is that a correct statement? It's not, is it? What's the difference? It's an ordinance. Okay, so if it's an ordinance, it's been put in place for the extraction reports to be. That being said, extraction, if we're going to go that route and look at that, we do have to keep in mind that there's certain ways of reporting the extractions. When the Water Resources Agency first came out with the idea of water well meters back in the early 1990s, a court case was filed in San Jose by Ralph Riva with Wente Vineyards of that requirement, and the case was won. In other words, growers do not have to put well meters on their wells, and that case was won in San Jose, I believe, in 1993. We still do report because we have other ways of reporting. That's just the comment I wanted to make about the extraction tiering, because there could be complications of how that's reported. Thank you.
Can you elaborate on that?
Thank you. They don't matter as far as what we were talking about, which was import-export of water. Right now, there's nothing that prohibits water transfer from one subbasin to another just because they are different subbasins. Water rights might matter for that, other things might matter for that, but there haven't been any ordinances or any actions yet taken. It's not applicable, thank you. That's an easier way to say it.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Yeah, Ellie, in the
And
various,
speak up, I'm sorry.
in the various slides you have on fallowing, you're saying low to medium costs in there, and I'm curious about how you're defining that. There's a professor at Berkeley, David Sunday, he's a professor of ag resources and ag economics, who did a study back in 2020 of fallowing in the San Joaquin Valley in the context of Sigma. And if you look at his study, the losses are staggering. It's billions and billions of dollars, tens of thousands of job loss, billions in employee compensation loss. It's a huge effect. So I'd have difficulty thinking about that as low to medium cost. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. And then also, real quickly, on the tiered extraction fees, if we're contemplating something like this in one subbasin, and they're obligatory, and then a couple feet across the subbasin boundary line into the next subbasin where they're not required, how are you thinking about that disconnect, neighbor to neighbor?
Okay. Brett volunteered for the second one. I'll take the first one. I did not mean to make light of the economic impacts of fallowing, right? They are severe to certain parties, and as I mentioned, part of this is how you distribute those costs. You know, if you set up a fallow bank, what the compensation is for fallowing, how the economic cost structure of fallowing or a fallowing action would be put in place, right? If it's solely borne by the grower that is doing the fallowing, certainly you're losing that economic value that you would get from the crop on that land. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is kind of a broad brush spectrum that we tried to put together just to orient people as to what's lower in cost versus higher in cost with respect to the per acre foot or the water benefit that you would receive. So the benefit compared to cost of these, but it really depends on the design of each action, how broadly it's put in place, how, I guess, in depth it's put in place. So there are a lot of questions, and we, in a little presentation, couldn't go into depth about all of those, but if you stick around with the GSA on certain ones, I mean, we're not gonna go down necessarily all of these, but you know, they do need to be designed thoughtfully. It's just trying to orient people to what generally was higher cost for the benefit versus lower cost for the benefit. And we could be wrong. This is not based on an economic analysis. It's just for the purpose of trying to get you to think that there are variable costs and benefits.
Abby, is it also fair to say, to the gentleman's point of view, that when we're looking on these slides of minimum, low, high cost, to some degree this is about the cost at the localized level by the agency of implementation or the parties? It doesn't factor in the greater points you're saying, which is the broader societal, the broader economic components, because as Abby said, there's not been that economic analysis, so it's more sort of the localized kind of impacts, but the points you're making are absolutely accurate, valid, which is why I spoke at the beginning of the day of why fallowing, allocation, things like that are so onerous and are scary to people, which is why we want to broaden the conversation on what are the other options and where are credits already due for work that's already been done. Because there's this economic analysis that we don't know what the implementation is.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
On to fees, my favorite topic. Actually, the next presenter, Nick, and I, we work together and we've been through fee studies a couple of times at least together. I would not think that that the situation where in one subbasin we have tiered fees and the other one we don't is a good idea. But what I'm thinking might happen or might be necessary if it's Prop 218 is there needs to be a very direct nexus between the cost and the benefit received. So maybe the tiers are different depth and different width in one subbasin based on the actions they have chosen. So I could see that maybe working out, because it is truly, I know with the urban side, if a certain project is implemented, constructed, and it only benefits a portion of that service area, you could establish different fees for that. So that could come into play. But the other piece is, we're not going to do anything that you're not going to tell us to do. So I think it's a lot of things is going to come if it's appropriate for this basin, and majority of the stakeholders there want to do that. The agency might go with whatever is the local control piece of it. What comes next? Yeah. So 6 subbasins, 6 sub-basin implementation committees. We have plans, sustainability plans, and now we need to implement them. And we really would like to work with each of those, your representatives, to choose out of the plans. There's PMAs, projects and management actions. Not only choose just on an emotional level what they feel is right, but do some sort of feasibility, return on investment analysis. What would work the best for this smaller region from the whole sub-basin? So we are using that. This is informational. We are going to take the input from those workshops and start working on with sub-basin implementation committees. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the decisions get made and discussed and then brought to the board, what we think is appropriate, applicable, and makes sense for those. So that is to come, and Dave is going to help us with that too. We're starting with 18400 because it is 2 years ahead of the others based on the being critically overdrafted basin. It needs to move at a little faster pace, so it started 2020, 2025. The first 5-year update is due, and we have a grant for that work, so we do want to start working with that sub-basin first, learn from that, and then carry on to the others.